what is the right relationship between Washington and the tech companies? Should it sort of be an adversarial relationship between Washington and Silicon Valley? Should there be a different dynamic? Should there be more? Is it going to be just a tug of war, or should there be a new normal of sorts that people should be trying to get to?
Yeah, 23 years ago, T.J. Rogers, he was the CEO of Cypress Semiconductor, the father of libertarian movement in Silicon Valley. He gave a speech saying why Silicon Valley should not normalize relations with Washington, D.C. Well, 2 decades later, I'm sorry, we have a relationship, and it isn't working. I think that your title for this panel is excellent. It's about reboot, and we definitely need to reboot this relationship because it's not working for anybody. Silicon Valley feels like an enthusiastic guy who just cannot figure out what his partner wants from him. He gets contradictory signals. He gets conflicting demands, and then 180-degree reversal in what his partner wants every time there's an election. A couple of examples. Congressional Democrats in the White House are insisting more COVID content moderation on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, while Republicans in the states want less moderation. NetChoice had to sue the state of Florida this summer over their law that would have forced our members to carry content they don't want to carry that violates their community standards. On antitrust, the Democrats in the White House want to change antitrust laws to advance economic justice and a broad progressive agenda, but most Republicans disagree. Although a handful of Republicans are going along with it just to punish Facebook and Twitter for locking Donald Trump's accounts on January the 6th. I can give examples on privacy, but think about it. We get the scapegoating that goes on with tech. We get that. But what is the signal that we're supposed to be learning amid all the noise? We just want to understand what is it that DC really wants from Silicon Valley.
Steve, what do you think? You talked about how there is a lot of uncertainty right now between Silicon Valley and the states. I mean, would creating a new single digital regulator help with that?
I don't think so, Leah. I have to agree with Zach that Congress and the FTC have all the authority that they need. They just need more, perhaps, knowledge, deeper knowledge of the topics that they have. And in the case of the FTC and the Congress, they ought to be a little less politicized in the way in which they give advice. Leah, you just did an article this week on Washington's judgment on tech giants was already written. And this was, you didn't need to translate from Hebrew to know that Chair Khan has a hammer and she's just looking for a nail. She's already implementing, Chair Khan is already implementing her antitrust agenda and is not waiting for Congress to pass any laws. So in that respect, the FTC is now becoming just as political as the FCC. And that's sad because it's another source of uncertainty for our industry. And we've got to depoliticize agencies that are in charge of protecting American consumers.
Right now, the House has proposed a huge boost for the FTC on privacy in particular, about $1 billion. There's been some debate about the FTC issuing new rules on privacy in the absence of federal law. Now, Steve, do you think that would be helpful for tech firms who at least would then have sort of a roadmap? Or do you think that the FTC would be overreaching and perhaps should be waiting for Congress to take the lead?
Yeah, I think the FTC has the expertise and could issue regulations that are clear to follow. But the FTC has still got to follow the right procedure of giving notice and an opportunity for us to comment on in the public record on anything they come up with. Chair Lina Khan has swept aside all of the procedural guidelines that are there to ensure that the FTC solicits enough public input. And when it comes to privacy, think about it. Silicon Valley rolls out privacy-friendly changes to third-party cookies and interest-based tracking. And what happens? Advertisers and competitors rush to Washington to tell them to block the changes. It'll make their business harder. We saw innovations from Apple to detect child sexual abuse material on iPhones. And that's a number one priority, but suddenly privacy advocates are really upset and want to block those innovations. So even if the FTC had clarity, we still have varied interests that weigh in on Washington in order to steer the tech community, to steer Silicon Valley. And I return to my theme is that we get conflicting signals from DC. We need more clarity.
I know NetChoice has been very critical of the House package. I mean, what sort of changes in antitrust do you guys support?
Yeah, when you think about this interoperability mandate, I'm a former programmer. That's the way I made my living. I didn't work on Capitol Hill, and I'm not a lawyer. But as a software developer, I can tell you that the interoperability mandate baked into the HJC package will be a disaster for competition, for privacy, and for data security. There's a complete difference between phone number portability and data portability compared to having interoperability, where you open a hole into your application, which means that any competitor can see data that violates your own privacy requirements, can create security problems. And here's the worst of it. If Facebook, Twitter, YouTube want to introduce a new feature, maybe even a very pro-competitive, pro-privacy feature, the Access Act is going to require approval, a mother may I permission, from a group that is completely influenced by competitors who may not want to see that new feature added. And they can claim that for purposes of interoperability, it'll be difficult for us to emulate that feature. So why don't we block the innovation rather than be compelled to have to match it? So the Access Act, as designed, uses interoperability as a rhetorical trick that, in fact, will reduce the amount of competition and innovation, creates privacy and data security holes. So that bill needs to be scrapped and started over. And among the rest of the bills, the only one NetChoice thought made any sense at all was the idea of increasing the fees that are necessary to support the regulatory review that goes on for mergers and acquisitions. The rest of that package, though, is a Trojan horse, if you will, to allow a progressive agenda of economic and social justice to be jammed through the lens of antitrust. And there's no mistaking this, that when you look at what the Communist Party of China has done to its large tech companies, they've done it all under the rubric of antitrust. And maybe progressives see this as another great way to empower antitrust to achieve an agenda that they otherwise can't get through Congress. Because TikTok just this week is past YouTube in terms of views in the United States and the UK. And TikTok didn't have to do any mother may I's with YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter on creating the most fast-growing social network in the world. There's plenty of investment support and no barriers to entry, because it turns out that the network effects are not prohibitive. When Parler generated 15 million users, those people didn't have to bring all their friends with them from Twitter. They're able to join Parler and collect a new set of friends, and people can join multiple social networks at the same time. So much of the theory of network effects falls down on this. And I really believe the interoperability is something you ought to re-examine, Charlotte, because it is not as pro-competitive as you think it is. Yeah. So after I started my career as a programmer, I did sell my business. We were creating disruptive technologies, and I sold the company. In fact, the venture capital availability in this country is there because the path to exit for many startups, the path to exit is to be acquired by another company. That creates an opportunity to take that capital and start another entity. It also creates the opportunity that technology they bought from my company will be integrated into their own services. So there's a lot of fluidity and capital that is attracted. And it isn't just for people that build tools that are acquired and smushed into someone else's tool. You think about the social network choices that we have today. They are myriad. We are able to join multiple social networks. Social networks are able to get funding. And acquisitions are the way which we create liquidity and make it attractive for entrepreneurs and investors to get into the mix. This is a problem that Congress doesn't need to fix. When you think of the acquisitions that have been made by Facebook, Google, and others, those acquisitions often capitalize those new entities. Think about WhatsApp. WhatsApp was really struggling. It had technical issues. WhatsApp today is still free and is something that the rest of the world enjoys as the ability for them to communicate with friends and family. So often these acquisitions result in increasing the innovation and investment that goes into a technology when it's brought into the family under the umbrella of another company.
Do you think NetChoice would be more comfortable with a broader antitrust reform rather than a tech-specific one?
We'd be very comfortable with a broad antitrust reform that codifies into law the consumer welfare standard for antitrust. Think about it. We have to prevent antitrust law from being politicized and turned into a weapon to advance other agendas that have nothing to do with consumer welfare. We heard discussions about economic justice as the underlying objective of the Department of Justice's lead antitrust rep. That isn't part of the antitrust regime. It's about making sure that consumers are protected from restrictions on supply, from higher prices, from the lack of having choices. So the consumer welfare standard has served us well and should be codified so that it can't be tinkered with so easily by a Department of Justice or a Federal Trade Commission that has a preconceived notion of what it wants to do. You think about the 400-page report that Chair Khan assisted the House Judiciary Committee to write. Ironically, it included 4 companies. Oh, but it didn't include, say, Microsoft, and it didn't include Oracle. So was that a comprehensive look at the antitrust landscape, or was it something that was narrowly tailored to go after companies that were targeted for action for political reasons? Let's codify the consumer welfare standard. That makes more sense than anything, and it gives a clear roadmap for all industries. Now, I complained earlier that the tech industry, Silicon Valley, is really confused about the conflicting signals and the flip-flop at every election. And there are other industries that deal with that. I understand. But think about the auto industry. They at least understand that the country has a consensus, a bipartisan consensus about shifting to electronic vehicles. The energy industry understands they need to move to more renewables when it comes to energy production and away from fossil fuels. So all we really need in Silicon Valley are some clearer, broad signals that enjoy consensus support from both parties so that things don't get reversed every time we have an election, so that the agencies are clear on what Congress has authorized them to enforce. That's really all I'm looking for. No, we do need a reboot. Zach's exactly right, because Silicon Valley just wants to reestablish the fact that what we're all about is building companies, pleasing customers, growing our audience, and making money. Samuel Johnson once said that seldom is a man as innocently engaged as in the making of money. So just realize that's what Silicon Valley is all about. And we are not more powerful than DC. DC has all the power. Just help us understand what you want from us. And the biggest question is, does DC want a highly competitive and lightly regulated tech sector, or does DC want a very highly concentrated and heavily regulated tech sector? Those are the two choices. And right now, we're hearing both sides coming out of Washington.